The Talarian High Council laughed as the chained human was dragged before them, but their laughter would soon turn to ashes in their mouths. On Talax Prime, the insectoid Talarians were drunk on their own superiority. In the grand capital of Zarthax, they celebrated the enslavement of yet another race, the gentle Kalar. Tharos, the cruel leader of the High Council, proclaimed Talarian supremacy to the cheering crowds. But then a human captive was brought forth. Carl Adams, lone survivor of the wrecked TSS Odyssey exploration ship, stood bruised and bloody before the sneering alien leaders. His ship's debris still smoked on the planet's surface where it fell. "Kneel before your betters, primitive ape," Tharos clicked in amusement. His segmented eyes studied the human like a fascinating insect. Around him, the other counselors chirped and chittered with laughter. Carl raised his head defiantly. "You don't know what you're dealing with. If you think humanity will just roll over, you're in for a big surprise." "Such bold words for a helpless captive," Tharos exclaimed. "Your species will make excellent servants for the Talarian Empire. But first, I will keep you as my personal pet and learn everything about your homeworld's location." As guards dragged Carl away to the palace dungeons, the human's mind raced. He had to escape this prison and warn Earth of the coming Talarian invasion. The survival of the human race depended on him. In that dark cell, an audacious plan began to take shape. The overconfident aliens had no idea what a human was truly capable of. They would soon learn to regret their arrogance and their fatal underestimation of humanity. In the weeks that followed, Carl studied his captors, their language and their technology. He'd been an engineering major, good with machines. The force field generator that held him captive, while advanced, was simple enough for him to hack given time. He memorized the rotating guard shifts, calculating the optimal time to attempt his escape. When the moment arrived, Carl input a digital bypass code into the small control panel by his cell. The shimmering blue barrier flickered, then vanished. He slipped out into the empty corridor, following the route he'd mentally mapped out. He found a small maintenance shaft, barely wide enough for him to crawl through on hands and knees. It led down into a larger tunnel network that ran beneath the palace, perfect for stealthy travel. Carl emerged in a dimly lit storeroom, filled with crates of spare parts and folded Talarian uniforms. He quickly shed his tattered jumpsuit and donned the six-limbed alien garments, struggling a bit to fit his human frame into them. On a shelf, he spotted a small electronic device, a universal translator. He grabbed it and synced it with his neural implant. "The fleet will be ready to depart for the human world in 10 cycles, a passing Talarian was saying to his companion. "The Emperor wants the invasion at full strength, now that we have their coordinates." A chill ran down Carl's spine. The Odyssey's navigational data. They'd pulled it from the wreckage, and now they knew the way to Earth. He had to find a way to stop them, or at least slow them down. Sabotage was his best bet. Blending in with the workers and technicians, Carl snuck into one of the military installations. He planted a makeshift ion grenade on the central power relay, fleeing before it detonated in a blast of crackling energy. The lights went out and alarms began to sound. Carl repeated this at 2 more bases and a factory complex, then destroyed the stolen uniform and device. News of the attack spread quickly, and a furious Tharos made a public address. "The escaped human is behind this," the insectoid leader snarled. "I want him brought to me alive. 1,000 credits to the one who captures him." Now the entire city was searching for Carl. Patrols of heavily armed Talarian soldiers marched down every street. Hovering security drones scanned each passerby. Carl ducked into alleys, used rooftops and maintenance tunnels to evade pursuit. His marine training made him stealthy and elusive. But he wouldn't be able to hide forever. He needed allies, and to his surprise he found them in the most unlikely place, among the Talarians themselves. A Talarian maintenance worker pulled Carl into a shadowed alcove, just as a patrol stomped past. "I'm with the Resistance," the insectoid whispered. "We've been watching you, human. You fight well. Come with me. There are others who also oppose the Emperor's tyranny." Warily, Carl followed his rescuer down to a secret underground bunker. Inside, a mixture of alien species, including Talarians, worked at computer consoles and pored over schematics of Talarian ships and weapons. Carl introduced himself, realizing this ragtag group could be the key to saving his homeworld. "The Talarian fleet will be ready to launch in a matter of days," Carl said. "But I know their technology now. I can show you how to cripple their ships before they depart. If we coordinate our strikes, we can devastate their offensive capabilities." The resistance fighters looked at each other, then at Carl, some with suspicion but others with glimmers of hope. The human took a breath, then activated a holoprojector to lay out his audacious plan. Carl outlined his strategy for the assembled resistance fighters. Blueprints, schematics, and documents stolen during their sabotage flickered on the screens. "Our strikes have hurt them, slowed them down, but it's not enough," Carl said. "We need to hit them where it really hurts." A hand went up. It was Zekthal, a scarred Talarian veteran. "The bioweapons lab." Carl nodded. "Exactly, but to do that we need to know what we're up against." He turned to a human woman. "Dr. Samuels, tell them what you learned." Dr. Nathan Samuels stepped forward. Carl's team had extracted her and a dozen other humans from a secret Talarian black site. The haunted, defiant faces of the survivors gazed back at the resistance. "The Talarians have been experimenting on humans for years," Dr. Samuels said, "dissecting us, studying how we adapt, how we heal, what makes us resilient, and they've used that knowledge to engineer a virus keyed to human DNA." Murmurs of shock and anger rippled through the room. Carl gripped the table, his knuckles white. The image of bug-eyed aliens cutting into human captives made his blood boil. "This bioweapon, it's meant to wipe out humans," Dr. Samuels continued. "Trigger a pandemic that will devastate Earth and leave it ripe for conquest." "So disabling their ships, their weapons, that won't stop them," a grey-furred Kalar said. "So no," Carl agreed. "We need to neutralize this virus, make it inert, harmless." "I believe I can engineer a counter-agent," Dr. Samuels said, "but I'll need access to the Talarians' labs, their research data." "Then that's our next target," Carl declared. He pointed at a schematic. "This is their primary bioweapons facility." They spent the next 2 hours poring over entry routes, guard rotations, and containment protocols. The plan began to take shape: a stealthy infiltration via the waste disposal system, a coordinated assault on the research servers, and the deployment of the counter-agent. But then a proximity alert sounded. Zekthal pulled up a surveillance feed. Talarian troop transports descended from orbit, disgorging hundreds of soldiers in full combat gear. "Reinforcements from the outlying garrisons," Zekthal growled. "Tharos is tightening the noose." "He's getting desperate," Carl said. "Afraid of looking weak with the rebellion spreading." "Our odds just got a lot worse," Dr. Samuels said. "Even if we deploy the counter-agent—" Carl stared at the tactical display, watching the flood of red icons converging on their location like hungry ants. He made a decision. Carl stood. "I'll create a diversion, get myself captured, make a lot of noise, draw Tharos and his goon squad away from the real mission." "Carl, no," Dr. Samuels said. "If they get their hands on you again—" "This isn't up for debate," Carl snapped. "You're the one who can stop this virus. You're the one Earth needs." He looked to Zekthal. "Get her into that lab. I'll buy you as much time as I can." Zekthal gave a solemn nod. He barked orders, and the resistance leapt into action, checking weapons, distributing equipment, scrubbing data from the computers. Carl armed himself and moved toward the exit tunnel. Dr. Samuels caught his arm. "Carl, I know the risks," he said. He managed a tight smile. "You just get it done, Doc. Save our people." Then he was moving, following a winding route to the surface. He emerged into the chaos of ships, vehicles, and insectoid soldiers swarming the streets. He activated a beacon, sending out a pulse that would lead them right to him. "Come on, you overgrown cockroaches," Carl snarled and opened fire. "Carl's capture sent shockwaves through the resistance, But they had no time to mourn. The mission was still go. In the grand assembly hall, thousands of Talarians clicked and chattered as Karl was dragged before the Emperor's dais. Tharos loomed above, his multifaceted eyes glinting with malice. This human thought he could defy the might of the Talarian Empire, Tharos boomed. Screens flickered to life around the hall, displaying footage of Karl's sabotage. Behold the depths of his crimes. Smoking ruins, panicked citizens, Talarian soldiers crushed beneath rubble. The crowd erupted in hisses and shrieks of outrage. Humans are a pestilence, a blight upon the galaxy, Tharos seethed. They care nothing for order, for the rule of law. They spread chaos and destruction wherever they crawl. Karl lifted his head, meeting Tharos's gaze. The Emperor's mandibles quivered with rage. You're right, Karl called out, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. We humans do tend to upset the order of things, especially when that order is built on slavery, on cruelty, on the suffering of billions. Stunned silence rippled through the hall. Tharos's bulbous eyes narrowed. Humanity will never submit to tyranny, Karl continued. We'll never stop fighting for freedom, not just for ourselves, but for all those you've ground beneath your heel. Cries of assent rose from the galleries, from the huddled masses of a dozen conquered species. Tharos slammed a clawed fist onto his throne. Enough. I will hear no more of this drivel. He jabbed a pointed finger at Karl. You wish to challenge the Talarian Empire? Then face me in the ancient rite of combat if you dare. Gasps echoed through the assembly hall. To refuse such a challenge was unthinkable, a stain upon Talarian honor. Tharos's mouthparts twisted in a cruel approximation of a smile, certain this primitive ape was no match for his superior strength and cunning. But Karl simply spread his hands, a defiant grin on his bruised face. I accept. As the crowd erupted in a frenzy of clicks and screeches, Dr. Samuels crouched in the shadows of the bioweapons facility. She glanced at her timepiece, then at the vial of counter-agent in her hand. Hold on, Karl, she whispered. Just a little longer. Her strike team fanned out, silenced weapons at the ready. They moved swiftly, neutralizing guards and technicians with ruthless efficiency. They couldn't afford a single alarm. At the facility's heart, a massive sealed chamber held row upon row of gleaming silver canisters. The Talarians' virus stockpile, ready to be loaded into warheads and launched at Earth. Dr. Samuels hacked the door controls, her breath catching as it hissed open. She and her team hurried inside, planting explosive charges and cracking open the canisters. They moved quickly, methodically, knowing every second counted. Dr. Samuels inserted the vial into an injector port, watching as the counter-agent drained into the chamber's air supply. Deploying neutralizing agent, she reported through her comlink. The virus will be inert in minutes. Good work, Doctor, Zekthal responded. We're transmitting the distress call now. With luck, the UEDF will arrive before the Talarians realize their bioweapons are useless. Dr. Samuels stared at the rows of neutered canisters, a tight smile on her face. We did it, Karl. We gave humanity a fighting chance. Then alarms began to blare, and the team scrambled for their extraction point. In the assembly hall, Karl was dragged into the combat pit, a circular arena with high metal walls. The jeers of the crowd washed over him as Tharos descended from his throne, discarding his ceremonial robes. The Talarian Emperor was a mass of segmented limbs and rippling muscle, his exoskeleton gleaming like polished onyx. He towered over Karl, pincers clacking eagerly. A gong sounded, and Tharos surged forward with blurring speed. His first blow sent Karl tumbling, pain exploding through his chest. He rolled to his feet, spitting blood, as Tharos came at him again. This was what the Talarians wanted, a spectacle, a display of their leader's power and Karl's humiliation. But he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Karl dodged and weaved, using his smaller size to slip under Tharos's grasping claws. He struck at joints and soft spots, putting all his strength into each punch and kick. But Tharos was fast. His exoskeleton hardened against impact. His blows rattled Carl to the bone, cracking ribs and splitting skin. Carl's vision blurred, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't beat Tharos in a straight fight, but maybe he didn't have to. As Tharos lunged in for a crushing strike, Carl dropped and rolled between his legs. He came up behind the Talarian, leaping onto his back and wrapping his arms around his throat. Tharos thrashed and writhed, but Carl held on with grim determination. He squeezed with every ounce of strength, choking off Tharos's air supply. The Emperor's struggles grew weaker, his motions sluggish. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the sight of their ruler brought low by a mere human. Tharos collapsed to his knees, and Carl released his hold, letting the Talarian slump to the ground. Breathing hard, Carl staggered to his feet. He looked out at the shocked faces of the assembly, seeing fear and uncertainty in their multifaceted eyes. Armored Talarian guards dragged Carl into the ritual combat arena. Thousands of insectoid aliens filled the stands, clacking and hissing. Subjugated races watched fearfully, hoping the human would fall. At the arena's center stood Emperor Tharos in gleaming black battle armor, gripping a crackling energy glaive. "I will enjoy crushing your bones, ape," Tharos snarled. The gong rang out. Tharos surged forward, glaive slashing. Carl rolled under the blow, snatching up a discarded shield. He deflected the follow-up strike, servos whining. Tharos was fast, strong, protected by armor. Carl struck at the joint of Tharos's leg. The Talarian staggered, and Carl used the opening to slam his shield into Tharos's face. Chitin cracked. Tharos screeched in pain and rage. "You cannot win, human." Tharos fired his glaive. The energy pulse hit Carl's shield, sending him skidding across the arena floor. "I am Talarian. I am superior." Carl struggled to his feet, looking at Tharos's armor, searching for a weakness. The resistance had stolen schematics. There had to be something. There, a power conduit running up the back of the neck. If he could sever it. Tharos charged, glaive raised. Carl sprinted toward him. Then baseball slid between the Talarian's legs. He leapt onto Tharos's back, gripping the conduit. Tharos reached back, grasping, but Carl ripped the cable free. Sparks flew and Tharos howled. His armor went dark. Carl swung around and punched Tharos in the eye cluster. Once, twice, 3 times. Tharos reeled, ichor splattering. Carl moved in for the finishing blow. Tharos' eyes flashed red. He caught Carl's fist and squeezed. Bones popped and Carl screamed. Tharos hurled him across the arena. Carl hit the wall and crumpled. Foolish ape. Tharos stalked forward. Cybernetic veins pulsed beneath his exoskeleton. "I have transcended flesh. I am more than Talarian now." Carl dragged himself upright, vision swimming. Tharos was faster, stronger than before. His hidden enhancements had kicked in. Carl's weapons were gone. He was bleeding, bones broken. He couldn't win. Then he remembered Dr. Samuels's voice. The Talarian adrenal gland. A blow to the thorax can trigger a massive hormone surge. Their hearts can't take the strain. Carl stood tall, beckoning Tharos forward. "That all you got, bug?" Mandibles clacking in rage, Tharos blurred forward, claws extended to impale. At the last second, Carl twisted aside. He hammered his fist into Tharos's thorax, right over the adrenal gland. Once, twice, 3 times. Tharos staggered back. His eyes went wide. He clutched his chest, ichor spurting between his claws. He collapsed, convulsing, and lay still. Silence fell over the arena. Then the crowd erupted. The subjugated aliens were cheering, roaring Carl's name. An elderly Kilar slave stood on shaking legs. "The human has shown us the truth, that even the mightiest may fall. We need only stand together." Cries of assent, of anger, rippled through the stands. Talarian guards moved to suppress the unrest, but the mob surged forward. Claws and makeshift weapons tore at Talarian flesh. The first shots were fired. Carl stared at the fallen emperor, then out at the chaos engulfing the arena. The Talarian Empire, which had seemed so unassailable, was fracturing before his eyes. The resistance had struck a mortal blow, and the cracks were spreading. From high orbit, 1,000 points of light appeared, growing larger by the second. The United Earth Defense Fleet had arrived, called by the Resistance's message. Drop pods and assault shuttles fell like meteors toward the roiling cities below. Carl smiled through split and bloody lips. The battle was only beginning, but now at least there was hope. He turned to limp toward the med station as the first Marine boots hit Talarian soil. But even as the subjugated races rose up against their oppressors and the Resistance tasted victory, a new threat emerged from within the crumbling Talarian Empire. General Zartok, Tharos's ruthless second-in-command, seized control of the Talarian fleet in a swift and brutal coup. Aboard the command ship, Zartok stood before a phalanx of elite guards, his carapace gleaming with cybernetic enhancements. "The Emperor has fallen to the humans' treachery," he clicked, multifaceted eyes glinting. "But we will not let this infection spread further. We will crush this rebellion and burn the human homeworld to ash." Cheers erupted from the loyalist soldiers as Zartok's image was broadcast across the fleet. On the planet below, pockets of Talarian resistance emerged, engaging the rebel forces in vicious street battles. Carl, still battered from his duel with Tharos, gathered his allies in a hastily fortified bunker. Dr. Samuels tended to his wounds, while Zekathal and the others pored over intercepted transmissions. "Zartok's no fool," Zekathal growled. "He'll have the fleet blockade the planet, cut off any reinforcements. Then he'll bombard the surface until there's nothing left but dust." "We can't let that happen," Carl said, wincing as Dr. Samuels sealed a gash on his forehead. "If Zartok rallies the Talarian forces, he'll resume the invasion of Earth. Billions will die." "What can we do?" Dr. Samuels asked, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "We're outgunned and outnumbered." Carl pulled up a schematic of the Talarian command ship. "We get aboard Zartok's vessel and take him down. Cut off the head, and the body will fall." "Easier said than done," Zekathal noted. "That ship will be locked down tighter than a Kala's fist." Carl zoomed in on a small maintenance hatch near the ship's aft section. "That's our way in. A small team, quick and quiet. We disable the ship's defenses, sabotage the engines, and confront Zartok on the bridge." Nods of agreement circled the room. They all knew the risks, the odds stacked against them, but they also knew the price of failure. As Carl and his team made their preparations, a scout burst into the bunker, his insectoid face contorted with fear. "The Loyalists," he gasped. "They have a weapon, something new. Whispers say it's a planet killer, capable of destroying Earth, even without the bioweapons." A chill ran down Carl's spine. They were out of time. Under cover of the ongoing battle, Carl, Dr. Samuels, Zekathal, and a handful of resistance fighters infiltrated the Talarian command ship. They moved silently through the dimly lit maintenance tunnels, dispatching guards with quick, brutal efficiency. But as they neared the bridge, alarms began to blare. Zartok's face appeared on a view screen, his mandibles twisted in a cruel approximation of a smile. "Did you really think you could sneak aboard my ship, human? I've been monitoring your every move." Carl and his team burst onto the bridge, weapons blazing. Zartok's elite guards swarmed to protect their general, and a vicious firefight erupted. Consoles exploded and bodies fell as the rebels pushed forward, desperately trying to reach the ship's control systems. Zartok himself leapt into the fray, his cybernetic limbs a blur of speed and power. He backhanded Dr. Samuels across the face, sending her crashing into a bulkhead. Zekathal charged him, but Zartok's energy blade sliced through the Talarian rebel's chest, leaving him bleeding on the deck. Carl fought his way to Zartok, rage and desperation fueling his steps. The general was fast, strong, his movements precise and deadly, but Carl had something Zartok could never understand, the indomitable human spirit. They clashed in a whirlwind of strikes and counter-strikes, human fist against Talarian chitin. Sparks flew as they battered each other across the bridge, both driven by the knowledge that the fate of worlds hung in the balance. In a final desperate move, Carl managed to pin Zartok against a bulkhead, his hands locked around the general's throat. Zartok struggled, clawing at Carl's arms, but the human's grip was iron. For a moment, Carl hesitated. The memory of Tharos's broken body flashed through his mind, the weight of the mercy he had shown. Could he take this life, even one so steeped in cruelty and hatred? That moment of hesitation was all Zartok needed. The general's tail lashed out, the venomous barb sinking deep into Carl's side. Searing pain ripped through him, and his grip loosened. Zartok shoved him back, mandibles clicking in vicious laughter. "Foolish human," Zartok hissed, looming over Carl's crumpled form. "Your weakness is why your species will fall. The strong do not hesitate. They do not show mercy." Carl's vision blurred, his body burning with the venom's fire. His gaze fell on Dr. Samuels, on Zekthal's motionless form, the price of his compassion, the consequences of his principles. But as Zartok raised his blade for the killing blow, Carl saw something else, the faintest flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. A single, slender tendril snaking its way toward the ship's primary power core. As the slender tendril reached the power core, Dr. Samuels's fingers flew across the control panel. With a few quick keystrokes, she overrode the safety protocols and initiated a massive feedback loop. Warning klaxons blared as the core began to overload, energy surging through the ship's systems. Zartok's eyes widened in realization. He lunged for the controls, but it was too late. The core detonated in a blinding flash of light, the shockwave tearing through the vessel. Bulkheads buckled and exploded, consoles erupting in showers of sparks. Carl and Zartok were flung across the bridge like ragdolls. They slammed into a bulkhead, the impact driving the air from their lungs. Dazed, Carl struggled to his feet, his ears ringing. "We have to get out of here," Dr. Samuels shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. She hauled Zekthal's limp form toward the escape pods, Carl stumbling after her. But Zartok was faster. He tackled Carl and they tumbled into an open pod, grappling fiercely as the ship disintegrated around them. Carl's fist cracked against Zartok's exoskeleton, but the general's barbed tail lashed out, the venomous tip grazing Carl's neck. The pod sealed shut, launching automatically as the command ship exploded in a cataclysmic fireball. The shockwave slammed into the pod, sending it careening off course. Warning lights flashed red, the pod's systems damaged by the blast. Carl and Zartok, battered and bleeding, could only watch helplessly as the pod spiraled toward a nearby moon, its rocky surface rushing up to meet them. They braced for impact, the pod slamming into the ground with bone-jarring force. For a long moment there was only darkness and silence. Then, with a groan of pain, Carl pried open the pod's hatch. Pale, sickly light filtered in, illuminating the cramped interior. Zartok lay unmoving, a jagged shard of metal protruding from his thorax. Carl dragged himself out of the wreckage, his body screaming in agony. His left arm hung useless at his side, the shoulder dislocated. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, mingling with the sweat and grime caking his skin. He surveyed the desolate landscape, a sense of dread settling in his gut. The moon was barren, lifeless, its surface a bleak expanse of grey rock and dust. The pod had come to rest at the base of a towering cliff, its twisted remains scattered across the unforgiving terrain. There was no sign of Dr. Samuel, Zekthal, or any of the other resistance fighters. For all Carl knew, they had perished in the explosion, their sacrifices ensuring the sabotage of the planet killer. The thought filled him with a profound sense of loss and isolation. A rasping cough drew his attention back to the pod. Zartok emerged, his once gleaming exoskeleton now cracked and scorched. He clutched at the metal shard in his chest, ichor oozing from the wound. For a long moment the two enemies stared at each other, the weight of their shared predicament hanging between them. They were stranded, injured, on an inhospitable world, with no means of escape or communication. "We'll die here," Zartok clicked, his voice laced with pain and resignation. The mighty Zartok, slayer of worlds, undone by a single human. Carl shook his head. "We're not dead yet. We need to find shelter, assess our resources. If we work together, we might just survive this." Zartok's mandibles twitched in what might have been a bitter laugh. Work together? With a primitive ape like you? I'd rather let the void take me. Carl limped over to the pod, rummaging through the debris until he found the emergency kit. He tossed a med pack to Zartok, then began gathering anything that might be useful: ration bars, a portable generator, a spool of high-tensile cable. "Hate me all you want," Carl said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "But right now I'm all you've got, and you're all I've got. So we can either kill each other and die alone, or we can help each other survive. Your choice." Zartok stared at the med pack in his claws, then at the human before him. Slowly, grudgingly, he began to patch his wounds, his movements stiff with pain. "Very well, human, a temporary truce then, until we find a way off this rock." Carl nodded, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Truce." He turned to survey the forbidding landscape once more, the weight of their task settling on his shoulders. They had a long way to go, and the odds were stacked against them. But he was human, and if there was one thing his species excelled at, it was defying the odds. With grim determination, Carl shouldered the emergency kit and set off into the unknown, Zartok limping at his side. The once proud general seemed diminished, the fire of his hatred banked by the cold reality of their situation. They walked in silence for a time, picking their way across the rugged terrain. The moon's gravity was lower than either of their homeworlds, making each step feel slightly off balance. The thin atmosphere did little to shield them from the harsh glare of the system's sun, its pale light casting long shadows across the rocky plains. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and red, they came upon a shallow cave carved into the base of a towering cliff. Carl held up a hand, signaling for Zartok to halt. He peered into the shadows, his senses straining for any sign of danger. "Looks clear," he said, his voice hushed. "We'll camp here for the night." Zartok clicked his mandibles in agreement, too weary to argue. They limped into the cave, Carl setting down the emergency kit with a grunt of relief. He began to unpack their meager supplies, rationing out the food and water with careful precision. Zartok watched him work, his multifaceted eyes glinting in the fading light. "You humans," he said, his voice a rasping whisper, "you're like vermin, infesting every corner of the galaxy, adapting, surviving, no matter the odds. It's almost admirable in a way." Carl glanced up, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "We're stubborn, I'll give you that. Too stubborn to know when we're beaten." He tossed a ration bar to Zartok, then sat back against the cave wall, his injured arm cradled against his chest. The Talarian general caught the bar, turning it over in his claws with a look of distaste. "Your food is as unpalatable as your species," he clicked, but he tore into the bar nonetheless, his hunger overriding his disgust. They ate in silence, the only sound the distant howl of the wind across the barren plains. As the last of the light faded from the sky, Carl activated the portable generator, its soft hum filling the cave with a flickering glow. "Tell me, human," Zartok said, his voice cutting through the stillness, "why do you fight so hard for your world, your people? What is it that drives you to such lengths?" Carl was silent for a long moment, staring into the generator's pulsing light. When he spoke, his voice was distant, almost dreamlike. "When I was a kid, my dad used to tell me stories about old Earth," he said. "About the wars, the famines, the plagues that almost wiped us out. But we survived because we had to, because we refused to let our differences divide us." He looked up, meeting Zartok's gaze. "That's what drives me. The knowledge that we're stronger together than we are apart, that we can overcome anything as long as we stand united." Zartok was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "I understand," he said, his voice soft. "More than you know." He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "I was not always a general," he said. "Once I was a scholar, a thinker. I questioned the Empire's expansion, the subjugation of other species. But I was young, naive. I learned quickly that dissent was not tolerated." Carl leaned forward, his eyes intent. "What changed?" Zartok shrugged, a ripple of chitin. I saw the power of the Empire, the glory of conquest. I convinced myself that it was right, that we were bringing order to a chaotic galaxy. But now... He trailed off, his gaze distant. Now I am not so sure. Seeing you fight, seeing the strength of your convictions, it has made me question everything I once believed. Karl reached out, clasping Zartok's claw in his hand. The Talarian flinched but did not pull away. It's never too late to change, Karl said, his voice earnest. To be better than we were before. That's the lesson humanity learned, after all our mistakes and failures. That's the lesson we carry with us among the stars. Zartok looked down at their joined hands, a strange expression on his insectoid face. Perhaps, he said, his voice a whisper, perhaps there is still hope, even for one such as me. They sat like that for a long moment, two enemies turned allies, united by the shared struggle for survival. And as the generator's light flickered and danced across the cave walls, casting shadows that seemed almost alive, Karl felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. In the days that followed, Karl and Zartok worked tirelessly to repair the escape pod's distress beacon. They scavenged parts from the wreckage, jerry-rigging a makeshift antenna from scraps of metal and wire. They took turns keeping watch, their eyes scanning the skies for any sign of rescue. But the beacon remained silent, and no ships appeared on the horizon. The moon's harsh environment took its toll, their supplies dwindling with each passing day. Karl's wounds healed slowly, the gash on his forehead leaving a jagged scar. Zartok's exoskeleton regrew, but the process left him weak and drained. They talked often, trading stories of their worlds, their people. Karl spoke of Earth's green hills and blue oceans, of the cities that glittered like jewels in the night. Zartok spoke of Talax Prime's towering spires and vast underground warrens, of the rigid caste system that had defined his life. They argued too, their tempers fraying as the days stretched on. Karl accused Zartok of clinging to his old ways, of refusing to see the truth of the Empire's cruelty. Zartok accused Karl of naivete, of failing to understand the realities of a hostile galaxy. But always they found their way back to common ground. They shared rations and water, tended each other's wounds, worked side by side to keep the beacon running. And slowly, a bond began to form between them, a strange sort of kinship born of shared hardship and mutual respect. One night, as they sat huddled around the generator's feeble warmth, Zartok spoke of a memory long buried. "When I was a child," he said, his voice soft and distant, "I saw a star go supernova. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed, a burst of light and color that seemed to fill the entire sky." Karl looked up, surprised by the wistfulness in Zartok's tone. "What happened?" he asked, his voice gentle. So Zartok shook his head. "The Empire happened. They declared the system off-limits, a potential threat to Talarian supremacy. They burned the worlds that orbited that star, wiped out entire species in their fear and paranoia." He looked down at his claws, flexing them in the flickering light. "That was when I began to doubt," he said, "when I began to question the righteousness of our cause. But I buried those doubts, convinced myself that the Empire knew best. And now—" He trailed off, his gaze distant. Karl reached out, clasping Zartok's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "It's not too late," he said, his voice firm. "You can still make a difference, still fight for what's right. The Talarian Empire may be crumbling, but that doesn't mean your people are lost. They just need someone to show them a better way." Zartok looked up, his eyes glinting with a newfound determination. "You're right," he said, his voice strong and clear. "I have been blind for too long, but no more. When we return, I will do everything in my power to forge a new path for my people, one of peace and cooperation rather than conquest and subjugation." Karl smiled, a fierce pride welling up in his chest. "And I'll be right there with you," he said. "Humans and Talarians, working together to build a better future for all. It won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." Zartok nodded, his mandibles twitching in what might have been a smile. "Indeed," he said, "the road ahead is long and fraught with peril. But together, I believe we can overcome any obstacle, face any challenge. The galaxy will never be the same." And with those words, a new alliance was forged, a bond that would reshape the very fabric of the universe. For in the crucible of shared struggle and sacrifice, even the most bitter of enemies could find common cause, and the most unlikely of friendships could blossom like a flower in the desert. The beacon pulsed on, a steady rhythm in the darkness, a beacon of hope amidst the vast and uncaring void. And Karl and Zartok sat together, watching the alien stars wheel overhead, dreaming of a future they would build together, one step at a time. On Talax Prime, Dr. Samuel stood before the newly formed Provisional Council, her voice ringing with determination. "The Talarian Empire has fallen," she declared, "but our work is far from over. We must rebuild, not just our cities and infrastructure, but our very way of life. We must forge a new path, one of cooperation and equality, where every species has a voice and a stake in our shared future." Around the council chamber, representatives from a dozen alien races nodded in agreement, their faces bearing the scars of long oppression. Among them sat a handful of reformed Talarians, those who had seen the error of their empire's ways and fought alongside the resistance. "But even as we work towards this brighter future," Dr. Samuels continued, "we must remain vigilant. There are still those who cling to the old ways, who would see our fledgling democracy fail. We must root out these loyalists and bring them to justice, while also showing mercy to those who can be redeemed." As if on cue, an alarm sounded, and a holographic display flickered to life in the center of the chamber. It showed a map of the capital city, with red markers indicating loyalist activity. "We have reports of sabotage at the main power plant," a Kevlar councillor growled, "and an attack on a supply convoy just outside the city limits." Dr. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Deploy our security forces," she ordered, "and send word to the UEDF fleet. We may need their assistance in maintaining order." She paused, her eyes growing distant. "And keep searching for any signs of Karl or the escape pod. He's out there somewhere, and we won't rest until we bring him home." Light years away, on a barren moon, Karl and Zartok huddled over the escape pod's distress beacon, their hands working feverishly to repair the damaged circuitry. "Just a few more connections," Karl muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. Beside him, Zartok carefully soldered a frayed wire, his claws steady despite the tension in his frame. Suddenly a shot rang out, and a bolt of energy sizzled past Karl's ear. He whirled, his hand reaching for his sidearm as Zartok dropped into a combat crouch. A squad of Talarian loyalists emerged from behind a nearby ridge, their weapons trained on the unlikely duo. "Traitor!" the lead loyalist snarled, his eyes fixed on Zartok. "You betray your own kind to ally with this filthy ape? You disgrace the very name of Talarian." Zartok's mandibles twitched, but his voice was steady. "No, Krazitar. It is you who disgrace our people, clinging to a corrupt and brutal empire that has brought nothing but suffering. I fight now for a higher cause, for the good of all species." Krastar spat, his exoskeleton bristling with rage. "Then you will die alongside your human pet." He barked an order, and the loyalists opened fire, a hail of energy bolts ripping through the air. Karl and Zartok dove for cover behind the escape pod, returning fire with their own weapons. The air crackled with the exchange of shots, the rocky ground sizzling where bolts struck. Karl popped up, squeezing off a few well-aimed shots that sent two loyalists tumbling, their exoskeletons smouldering. Zartok, meanwhile, charged forward, his movements a blur of speed and precision. He closed the distance to Krastar, his claws locked around the other Talarian's weapon. They grappled, their exoskeletons scraping and clattering as they fought for control. Karl provided covering fire, picking off loyalists one by one. But they kept coming, pouring over the ridge in a seemingly endless wave. A bolt grazed Karl's shoulder, and he hissed in pain, his aim faltering for a moment. In that instant, Krazitar gained the upper hand, his claws closing around Zartok's throat. The reformed Talarian struggled, his eyes bulging as he gasped for air. But even as his vision dimmed, he saw Karl level his weapon, a look of grim determination on the human's face. The shot was true, striking Krastar square in the back of the head. The loyalist jerked, his grip slackening as he slumped to the ground. Zartok staggered away, rubbing his throat, as Karl rushed to his side. "You all right?" Karl asked, his voice rough with concern. Zartok nodded, his eyes meeting Karl's. "Thanks to you, my friend, we make a good team, you and I." Karl grinned, clapping Zartok on the shoulder. "That we do. Now let's get that beacon working and get the hell off this rock. We've got a galaxy to save." Together, they turned back to the escape pod, their bond forged in the crucible of shared struggle and sacrifice. The road ahead was long and fraught with peril, but they would face it side by side, a human and a Talarian, united by a common cause and an unbreakable friendship. As the distress beacon finally sputtered to life, its signal pulsing out into the void, Karl and Zartok allowed themselves a moment of hope. They had endured much, and there were surely more trials to come. But they had each other, and the knowledge that they fought not just for themselves, but for the future of all sentient beings. In the skies above Talax Prime, the UEDF fleet maintained its vigilant watch, a shining symbol of the alliance between Earth and the newly freed races of the Talarian Empire. Dr. Samuels, standing on the bridge of the flagship, gazed out at the stars, her heart heavy with the weight of leadership and the absence of her friend. "Where are you, Karl?" she whispered, her fingers brushing the cool glass of the observation deck. "We need you. The galaxy needs you." She closed her eyes, as if willing her thoughts to reach across the vast expanse of space. "Come back to us, Karl. Come back and help us build the future we've fought so hard for." The stars remained silent, but Dr. Samuel's resolve only grew stronger. She turned back to the bridge, her eyes hardening with determination. "Helm, set a course for the outer rim. We have a friend to find and a galaxy to rebuild." As the mighty ship surged forward, the light of distant suns glinting off its hull, a new chapter in the history of the galaxy was being written, a chapter of hope, of unity, and of the indomitable spirit of all those who dared to dream of a better tomorrow. And at the center of it all, two unlikely heroes, a human and a Talarian, bound by a friendship that would change the very fabric of the universe. The Loyalist squad's energy weapons flashed, searing the rocky ground around Karl and Zartok. Karl dove for cover behind a jagged boulder, his heart pounding. Zartok was pinned down a few meters away, returning fire with his own blaster. "We need to take out their heavy gunner," Karl shouted over the din of battle. Zartok nodded, his mandibles clicking. "Flank left, I'll draw their fire." Karl sprinted from cover, zigzagging as bolts sizzled past. He slid into a shallow ravine, using the terrain to mask his approach. Ahead, the Loyalist heavy gunner was pouring suppressive fire at Zartok's position. Unslinging a plasma grenade from his belt, Karl primed the charge. He counted down in his head, then lobbed the glowing sphere. It arced through the air and landed at the heavy gunner's feet. The Loyalist only had a moment to look down in surprise before the grenade detonated in a blinding flash. Karl leapt from the ravine, blaster spitting red bolts. Two more Loyalists fell, smouldering holes in their carapaces. Zartok surged forward, his vibroblade humming as he carved into the remaining enemies. In minutes it was over. The Loyalist squad lay dead, their weapons and armor scattered across the blasted ground. Karl lowered his blaster, breathing hard. "Zartok, we did it. We—" The words died in his throat as he turned and saw Zartok slumped against a boulder. Dark ichor seeped from a deep gash in the Talarian's side, his exoskeleton cracked and oozing. "No, no, no." Karl rushed over, dropping to his knees beside his wounded friend. He tore open a med pack with shaking hands, fumbling for the clotting agent and antiseptic spray. "Leave it," Zartok rasped, his voice weak. "My wounds are mortal. Save your supplies." "Like hell I will," Karl growled. He sprayed the sealant foam into the gash, watching it expand and harden to stem the bleeding. You're not dying on me, you hear? Not after everything we've been through. Zartok's eyes flickered, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Carl injected him with a cocktail of painkillers and stimulants, praying it would be enough to keep the Talarian alive. He dragged Zartok back to the battered escape pod, sealing the hatch behind them. For hours, Carl tended to Zartok as best he could, changing dressings and monitoring vitals. The Talarian drifted in and out of consciousness, his exoskeleton burning with fever. Carl talked to him constantly, recounting stories from Earth, describing the wonders of his homeworld that he hoped to one day show Zartok. Just as Carl began to despair, a shudder ran through the pod. He scrambled to the viewport, hope surging in his chest, as he saw a UEDF dropship descending through the moon's thin atmosphere. The ship touched down in a spray of dust, and armored figures emerged, racing towards the pod. The hatch hissed open, and a familiar face filled Carl's vision. Dr. Samuels, her eyes wide with relief and joy. "Carl, thank God we found you." She embraced him fiercely, then turned to the prone form of Zartok. Her expression turned grim as she took in the Talarian's grievous injuries. "We'll take it from here," she said, waving forward a team of medics. They transferred Zartok to a hover stretcher, rushing him back to the waiting dropship. As the ship lifted off, carrying them away from the desolate moon, Carl sagged into a seat, exhaustion overwhelming him. Dr. Samuels sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Carl. You survived. And from what little you've told me, it sounds like you and Zartok went through hell together." Carl nodded, his eyes distant. "He saved my life, Doc, more than once, and not just physically. He showed me that even the most hardened enemy can change, can become a friend." Dr. Samuels smiled softly. "Sounds like you had quite an impact on him as well. I think your story will give a lot of people hope in the days to come." The dropship broke atmosphere, the vast expanse of space opening up before them. In the distance, the glittering orb of Talax Prime grew larger, a world on the brink of a new era. As they touched down in the capital spaceport, a vast crowd had gathered to witness their arrival. Talarians and aliens of a dozen species packed the landing platform, a sea of hopeful faces upturned towards the sky. When Carl and Zartok emerged from the dropship, the crowd erupted into thunderous cheers. Cries of "heroes" and "saviors" filled the air, as the throng pressed forward to catch a glimpse of the human and Talarian who had defied the odds and forged an unlikely bond. Over the following weeks, as Zartok recovered from his injuries under the care of the best medical minds from a dozen worlds, he and Carl were hailed as symbols of the new era of cooperation and unity. Their story spread like wildfire, inspiring those who had once seen each other as bitter enemies to set aside their differences and work towards a common goal. Zartok, having witnessed firsthand the compassion and resilience of humanity, became one of the most vocal advocates for the alliance between the Talarian people and the other races. He worked tirelessly to bring the remaining loyalist factions to heel, negotiating surrenders and brokering treaties with a skill and passion that few could match. Carl, though his heart longed to return to Earth and the family he had left behind, knew that his work in Talarian space was far from over. He saw the fledgling coalition taking shape, saw the hope and determination in the eyes of those who had once been downtrodden and oppressed, and knew that he could not abandon them now. And so he stayed, lending his knowledge and experience to the Provisional Council as they worked to hammer out a new government, a new way forward for all the races of the sector. It was not an easy road, beset by challenges and setbacks at every turn. But Carl and Zartok faced each obstacle together, their bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship and tempered by the unbreakable strength of their friendship. And slowly, day by day, the dream of a united and peaceful galaxy began to take shape, built on the foundation of trust and understanding that two unlikely heroes had laid down. There would be struggles ahead, conflicts and crises that would test the resolve of this new alliance. But with leaders like Carl and Zartok at the helm, and with the indomitable spirit of all those who had fought and sacrificed for this chance at a better future, there was nothing they could not overcome. The road ahead was long, but they would walk it together step by step, until the light of a new dawn shone upon them all. As the Provisional Council worked tirelessly to rebuild and unite the fractured Talarian society, a series of coordinated attacks rocked the fragile peace. Government buildings were bombed, supply lines disrupted, and key figures assassinated with ruthless precision. Karl and Zartok, leading the investigation, uncovered a trail of evidence that pointed to a shadowy figure known only as the Overseer. This mysterious mastermind, it seemed, had been pulling the strings of the Talarian Empire from the beginning, orchestrating its campaign of conquest and oppression. And "We have to stop them," Karl said, his jaw set with determination. "If the Overseer succeeds, everything we've fought for will be lost." Dr. Samuels, poring over intercepted transmissions, looked up with a grim expression. "I've traced the Overseer's communications to a hidden base on the outskirts of the Zarthax system. It's heavily fortified and crawling with loyalist forces." Zartok's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "A frontal assault would be suicide. We need to infiltrate the base quietly, gather intelligence, and neutralize the Overseer before they can launch their endgame." Karl nodded. "Agreed. We'll need our best operatives for this mission, people we can trust." They assembled a small team of skilled fighters and infiltrators, drawn from the ranks of the Resistance and the reformed Talarian military. Together, they boarded a stealth shuttle and set course for the Overseer's stronghold. As they approached the base, the shuttle's sensors detected a massive energy signature. "By the stars," Dr. Samuels breathed. "The readings are off the scale. Whatever they're building in there, it's powerful enough to destabilize the entire sector." Karl's grip tightened on his weapon. "Then we'll just have to make sure they never get the chance to use it." They landed in a sheltered ravine and made their way towards the base's perimeter, avoiding patrols and disabling security systems as they went. Once inside, they split into two teams. Karl and Zartok would locate and confront the Overseer, while Dr. Samuels and the others would sabotage the base's defenses and gather critical data. As Karl and Zartok fought their way deeper into the complex, they faced wave after wave of fanatical loyalist troops and deadly automated defenses. They moved in perfect sync, covering each other's backs and combining their unique skills to overcome every obstacle. Finally, they breached the command center's blast doors and stormed inside, weapons raised. And there, standing before a bank of view screens, was a figure that made Karl's blood run cold. "Admiral Graves," he whispered, recognizing the haggard face of his former commanding officer. "But you died in the Battle of Karshan, leading the charge against the Krogan armada." The old man turned, his eyes glinting with madness and malice. "Oh, I died that day, all right, but the Overseer was born, reborn, with a glorious purpose, to forge humanity into the weapon it was always meant to be." Zartok snarled, leveling his blaster at the Overseer. "You're insane. You've caused untold suffering, all for your twisted delusions of human supremacy." The Overseer laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "You think you can stop me? I've already won. The Talarian Empire was just a means to an end, a tool to be used and discarded. With the power I've unlocked here, I will bring the galaxy to its knees." Karl shook his head, a profound sadness mingling with his anger. "I looked up to you, sir. I believed in you, but you're not the man I knew. You're a monster, and we're going to stop you." The room erupted into chaos as the Overseer's elite guards attacked. Karl and Zartok fought side by side, a whirlwind of plasma bolts and flashing blades. The Overseer himself joined the fray, his movements unnaturally fast and strong, enhanced by cybernetic augmentations. Karl found himself locked in a brutal hand-to-hand battle with his former mentor, trading bone-crushing blows across the command center. Consoles shattered, and sparks flew as they clashed, neither giving an inch. Zartok, seeing an opening, leapt towards the base's primary power core. He slammed a sequence of commands into the control panel, initiating an overload. Alarms blared and warning lights flashed red. "Karl!" Zartok shouted over the din. "The core's going critical. We have to get out of here." But the Overseer was relentless, hammering at Karl's defenses with inhuman strength. Karl staggered under the onslaught, his vision blurring. Zartok charged forward, slamming into the Overseer and knocking him away from Karl. The two rolled across the floor, grappling fiercely. "Go," Zartok yelled, locking the Overseer in a chokehold. "I'll hold him off." Karl struggled to his feet, torn between the urge to fight and the knowledge that time was running out. The base shuddered around them, the power core's containment field failing. "Zartok, no, we can still make it." But the Talarian just shook his head, a fierce grin on his face. "This is my choice, my friend. My sacrifice. For the future we dreamed of." With a final wrenching effort, Karl turned and ran, tears streaming down his face. He burst out of the command center, just as Dr. Samuels and the others reached the extraction point. They piled into the waiting shuttle and rocketed away, the base collapsing behind them in a blinding flash of light. As the shockwave buffeted the shuttle, Karl slumped against the bulkhead, his heart heavy with grief and loss. Zartok was gone, but his sacrifice had saved them all. Had saved the galaxy from the Overseer's mad ambitions. In the days that followed, the Provisional Council and the Allied races came together to honor the fallen hero. They erected a monument on Talax Prime, a towering statue of a human and a Talarian standing side by side, united in purpose and friendship. Karl, his eyes haunted but his resolve unshaken, stood before the gathered dignitaries and spoke of the future they had to build, a future of cooperation, of understanding, of peace. "Zartok gave his life for this dream," he said, his voice ringing out across the plaza. "For the idea that we are stronger together than we ever could be apart. It falls to us now, to all of us, to make that dream a reality." As the crowds cheered and wept, Karl looked up at the stars, remembering the journey that had brought him to this moment. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.